Before further elaboration of the colonial construction of Hindu-Muslim conflict, let us step back and ask a related question. If a dichotomous understanding of Hinduism and Islam is a colonial construct, how did Hindus and Muslims represent themselves and each other in the pre-modern era? The terms Hindu and Muslim as markers of religious difference or identity hardly appear in pre-colonial literature about the other, whether belonging to Indian or Islamic traditions. Similarly, Islam and Hinduism as systems of religious doctrine and practice are conspicuously absent as descriptive of the other. If you look at pre-modern Hindu texts, it's very hard to find descriptions of Muslims. And similarly, pre-modern Muslim texts don't talk about Hindus as some kind of collective whole. It has been well documented that the term Hindu does not have an indigenous Indian origin, but came to be used to denote the cultural groups inhabiting the subcontinent by Muslims and as well as others, by whom it was used primarily as a geographical and not a religious marker. So the term was used as a geographical marker of people who lived east of the Indus and not as describing a religion. It was not used self-referentially by the religio-cultural groups designated by it until the colonial era. Again, Hindus did not think of themselves as Hindus. This term was not used in barely ever in pre-19th century. There are few examples here or there of Eknath and some other people, but in 17th century, I believe. But generally, as a popular term, it was not used by Hindus to describe themselves. It was first used by the British and then adopted by Hindus themselves as well as other South Asian religious communities, including Muslims and Sikhs and so forth. In the same manner, although the term Muslim and Islam have a Quranic origin and were long used by Muslims, they were transformed into modern religious identity markers only in the colonial period. So the way that Islam and Muslim were used have been transformed, although since they're the same terms, we don't understand how they have actually been, what kind of changes they have come. So specifically, the manner in which Islam with a small I became Islam with a capital I, as it was mapped onto a modern meta-narrative of religion, changed the term from its primary etymological meaning of submission to God as an individual's action to a meaning in which Islam denoted primarily a collective identity and was a species of the genus religion, differentiated from other species like Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, and so on. This is a much longer discussion about religion that we don't have to, and especially the modern creation of the idea of religion. That we don't have time here, and if somebody's interested, we can talk about it later. So the still useful classic work of W.C. Smith, one of the great Western writers on religion generally, and particularly Islam, The Meaning and End of Religions, was perhaps the earliest to argue how the modern concept of religion objectified and reified rich and diverse lived and experienced traditions into this kind of abstraction or into a system of ideas and beliefs. So furthermore, pre-modern Hindu texts do not use the term Muslim. Rather, they use ethnic terms such as Turushka, which means Turk, or all-purpose labels for foreigners such as Yavana, which I think comes from Ionian, meaning Greek, and really goes back to probably time of Alexander, or terms to denote outsiders from a Brahmanical perspective, such as Malich, Malekha, which signifies someone outside the pale. Muslims were not really seen as some kind of collective entity that had dawned upon India, like the Hindutva or BJP kind of people argue. So Muslims were not recognized as a religious category by non-Muslim Indians until they were officially identified as such by the colonial British through such significant administrative measures as the census. So all of a sudden you had to identify yourself, and this would become your official religion. And there were certain groups, such as the Sikhs, which were not recognized by the British at first, had to fight for their recognition as a separate religious community. And there were other groups that weren't able to do what the Sikhs did, and were forced to kind of either get pulled into, like the Kabir Panthis and so forth, into Hinduism or Islam or some other tradition. So this categorization was then internalized in South Asia, and the colonial British identification of Muslim as a religious category, opposed to the similar religious category of Hindu, came to be adopted by newly self-identified Hindus. So religious belonging in pre-modern South Asia, so looking at the other side now, was quite unlike the strict classification schemes employed by the British and then adopted by South Asians. Perhaps it's best to look at them, contextualize them locally and temporally. So Dominique Silla Khan, whose work we'll look at a little bit in a minute, has spoken about how, quote, in medieval India, people were classified mainly according to categories of jat or zat, jati or pant, which refer respectively to social or professional class and spiritual path. That's how people generally identified themselves. Significantly, Muslims in South Asia were also socially stratified, just as other groups, with a central division. Again, they were part of certain jatis and so forth as well, but also this division between ashrafs, Muslim elites who came from outside of South Asia, at least trace their ancestors from outside of South Asia, and ajlaf, who were converted Indians. The other term that Silla Khan references above, pant, as well as similar terms like marg or sampradaya and even tariqa in certain contexts, were particular traditions founded by spiritual masters. And this was used by many South Asians over the last several centuries to identify themselves. And so a main source of identity for many people was not identifying as I'm Muslim, I'm Hindu, but rather identifying with particular panths or particular spiritual communities that they were part of. Whether these were say the panths of Kabir and Guru Nanak, which again I mentioned previously, the Kabir Panthis eventually ended up being absorbed mostly into Hinduism. Guru Nanak was crystallized into the religion of, the followers of Guru Nanak were crystallized into the religion of Sikhism under British colonial rule. So in these two celebrated cases, the creation of a new panth served to distinguish the inner spiritual message from the outward institutional and authority structures represented by the Brahmins and the ulama. But in addition, there were a tremendous variety of religious practice and even doctrine among Muslims when one looks beyond the official Islam of the ulama associated with Muslim political rule. In addition to Sunnis, there were many Shi'i groups, and the Ismailis in particular very creatively engaged the Indian environment, not to mention the richness and diversity of Sufism in South Asia. The widespread influence of Sufism particularly facilitated processes by which Muslims in South Asia were seen and saw themselves as part of a panth, a distinctive spiritual tradition, instead of a theologically rigid religion opposed to other religions and paths. So on this note, many pre-modern Muslims identified themselves, as many do now as well, as members of a tariqa or followers of a particular Sufi master, instead of kind of a generalized conception of being a Muslim part of a universal ummah, although that consciousness was always there as well. So the point that emerges from these observations is that religion emerged from particular, often local, lived traditions, and not from identification with an abstract and conceptualized Islam or Hinduism. Prior to this atemporal ideas of Islam and Hinduism, there existed the particularities of local and temporal contexts where religious traditions and their interactions were constantly negotiated. Hypothetically, if one were to ask a pre-modern South Asian what their religion was, if it was possible to find the right words to frame such a question, he or she would likely reply by naming the various practices, traditions, and beliefs obtained from his family, his village, his or her jati, his or her panth, or a certain charismatic guru or peer. And if you look at the British census, this is what they're surprised at. They ask people, what is your religion? They'll mention, oh, gurus, this, that. Or, my father goes to this shrine. And then they observe these same people like going to some other, they go to the Sufi dargah as well. So they're extremely confused. Some of the writings of British officials doing the census are like, we can't make sense of this. make very clear categories, and they had to really do it many times before being able to put people in very specific categories. So it must be added that Muslims, of course, there was no doubt a connection to a larger collectivity, as well as holy places and personages not situated in India. But the way such affinities were made concrete was precisely by channeling them through the local. So for example, examples of this is a saint buried in the nearby village who represents the sanctity of the Prophet, because he says he's a descendant of the Prophet. So you have both the local Indian, but it's channeling the universal, the sanctity of the Prophet. Or a family lineage that claims its origins in a companion of the Prophet whose descendants had moved to India. Or even more daring theological moves, such as the Satpant Ismaili hymns that paint Hazrat Ali as an avatar of Vishnu. So these are very interesting Satpant Ismaili hymns. So it's a way of adapting to the Indian context. So through such associations, Muslims negotiated what Richard Eaton, and this is a very fascinating story, again, maybe for another day, about how the Ismailis, when the Aga Khan came to India, had to really choose between being Sunni Muslim, a Shia Muslim, Ismaili, and or Hindu, and different parts of the community chose these because of this because of this history in which they had been in taqiyya for so long, and had used this kind of Hindu terminology and so forth. The Sant movement is another movement associated with Kabir, Nanak, Dadu, Mir, of a liminal tradition in which identities are overlapped. So many different traditions claim these people, and sometimes new traditions emerge from these kinds of overlapping traditions. Now, just to conclude, infidels, according, it brought Islam and peace to the land. And so they took, the Muslims are admitting themselves, they slaughtered 100,000 here, and then another passage, 1 million here. All right. So Muslims killed, these billions of people, or millions, and Hindutva historians still use this, like numerologically, based on these kind of British colonial historians. So, this kind of history became normative in British, during the British Raj. And there were other things, such as the Christian missionaries, who tried to preach Christianity to everyone in India, and their conception of what religion was adopted by those people trying to respond to them. And this is still kind of going on, with a lot of people who are, who do kind of debates with people like Ahmed Deedat and Zakir Naik and so forth. A lot of the categories they're adopting, the way they argue about Islam, is very largely based on Christian missionary discourse. It comes out of this, they say that, for example, in the case of Hindus, it's even easier to see. Hindus, they had no kind of missionary debates prior to the Indians coming, prior to the Christians coming. Once the Christian missionaries came, and said, for example, Hinduism is idolatry and so forth. Certain Hindus said, it's monotheism, it's even more of monotheistic than Christianity. And this, again, is one of the roots of, say, something like the Hindutva movement. I think I'll end here. There's other things we could continue, but